So super happy to have everybody here. What I wanted to kind of just get kicked off with is to talk a little bit about not only like what we're going to do today, but I wanted to set a little bit of context for how this conference kind of came to be and what we're trying to accomplish with it. The interesting thing that that we're starting to see is that the conversation around Agile is starting to shift in the marketplace a little bit. And people are less concerned about how to do Agile at scale. They're less concerned even about transformation, and they're more concerned about how do we connect it to the business, right? How do we solve the problems that our executives really care about? And so probably, I guess it was like earlier this year, Tim and I were talking about the idea of possibly pulling together and doing some sort of kind of like a business agility conference, something around like how do we elevate this story in the marketplace. And so what we did is we said, okay, well, we're going to do this conference and we're going to try to find a cool venue to do it in and try to do something that was pretty awesome. And what was kind of funny about it is that we had no idea how many people would actually come to it. Right? And so when we first set it up, we said, okay, well, we're going to do 150 people. And then 150 people signed up. And then we opened it up to 300, and 300 people signed up. And so here we are, right? So what we're hoping, again, to try to figure out how to do is to set the stage for a conversation around what does it really take to do Agile? What does it really do to connect to the business problem? The impetus behind this talk probably started somewhere around 10 years ago. And one of the neat things I got to do is, and again, you have to think 10 years ago, Leading Agile hadn't even really started. I think I was probably still working at version 1 during that time. And I got to spend a little bit of time with Alistair Coburn up in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was up at David Span's place up there and was having this conversation, and I was talking about some of the early ideas around Agile transformation, Agile at scale. And if you remember during this time, 10 years ago, right, SAFe wasn't really even out, right? Like a lot of the things that we're talking about like that are like very commonplace in market weren't even out. And I was sharing some of these ideas with Alistair. And Alistair said something, it was like a line that like is literally stuck in my brain for 10 years. He goes, when we were out in Snowbird and we were trying to define Agile and we were talking about the Agile Manifesto, we were focused on a thing, right? They were trying to solve a problem, and this is my interpretation, but they were solving like a team level agility problem. Like how do we pull a project out of the ditch when it's when we're not connected with the customers, when we don't have complete cross-functional teams? Right? How do we get visibility and how do we get iterative and incremental delivery? And so they coined the Agile Manifesto. But they were solving a very specific class of problem. And the line that he said to me that's literally stuck in my brain for 10 years was, what we're trying to do now is something different. Right? So this was, again, as SAFe was beginning to emerge, before the business agility conversation, before the digital transformation conversation. What we're trying to do now is something different, right? Agile's a thing. What we're trying to do now is something different. And so that stuck with me for about 10 years. And then if you think about the evolution of the conversation around Agile, I remember when I first got into this community, the question that everybody would always ask me is, how do I get my executives excited about doing Agile? Like, how do I get them to want to do it? That conversation's like past, right? That's like nobody's concerned about that anymore. Most organizations on some level want to do Agile. They want agility. So that's not the conversation anymore. The conversation shifted to, how do I do Agile at scale? And then it shifted into, how do I do Agile transformation? And one of the things that I've observed over the last year and a half, candidly, from sitting in front of executives like you guys in like pre-sales capacities and things like that, is that a lot of times I would be trying to tell a big story. I would be talking about Agile and SAFe and how it fits into the larger ecosystem and what we're trying to accomplish and how it links to business agility. And maybe some of you guys will resonate with this, but it was like as soon as I would mention SAFe or Scrum or whatever, the executive would say, I'm not talking about that. That's what the teams do, right? What I'm talking about is business agility, or what I'm talking about is solving a business problem. And that was a really fascinating shift in perspective for me, because I thought that I was out there telling a pretty big story, and I thought that I was out there connecting the dots for people. But the thing that was really stuck in my head is that Agile in a lot of ways has, I don't know the word I'm looking for, it's kind of become commoditized. The conversation around it has become commoditized. And if you think about the history of Agile, it absolutely did start as a small team methodology. And then it became this larger thing. And candidly, what I think we haven't necessarily always done a great job at as a community is connecting the dots for our business leaders about how you go from team-level agility or even Agile at scale into solving real business problems. There's this kind of underlying hypothesis that if we do these Agile things, we'll get these better outcomes. But I think most of you guys would probably agree that in practice, often that doesn't happen, right? We have a lot of teams, and this is a very common refrain from people we talk to, is that we'll say, we've got the team-level Scrum stuff down. We're even doing some Agile at scale pretty well, but we're just not having the impact on the organization that we need to have, okay? And I think that's a natural part of the progression, because I think we had to solve some of the team-level agility stuff. And by solving that, we basically realized that the constraint moved outside of the team. It moved into the program, into the portfolio level, and it moved into the business, and it moved into other parts of the organization that hadn't necessarily considered Agile. And so what's kind of fascinating is that as that conversation has expanded, the people that it's expanded into have started to think about what we're doing at the team level as Agile. And a lot of times, they want to have a different conversation. Okay? And so that was just kind of the observation, and that was the observation under the fundamental hypothesis behind this conference. And here's the interesting thing, and I think the reason why I care, and the reason what I'm hoping you guys care about, and the reason why we wanted to do this, is because there's so much that is valid with the stuff we know, right? So Scrum's here. Scrum's not going away, right? The XP practices, the agility at scale stuff that we're starting to learn about. It's here and it's valid. But what I think we have to figure out how to do is contextualize it differently and help the broader community of people that are maybe outside of IT understand how it connects and how it actually supports their goals, right? So when we do team-level agility, or when we do Agile at scale in product development, right, how does that translate really specifically into better business outcomes, okay? So again, this conference, and what we're trying to do today, is an exploration of that hypothesis. That if we can figure out how to take what's really good and solid about what we know and connect the dots very explicitly into the rest of the parts of the business, then we can, again, the name of the conference, we can elevate the conversation around Agile and not have to totally reinvent the language. What I think is kind of fascinating is that, and you watch this happen over time, it's like Agile kind of becomes passé, right? It's like people don't want to talk about it. There's a lot of organizations we walk into where you can't even use the word Agile. It's so damaged as a brand in a lot of places. And I think that's unfortunate, because I don't think it has to be that way, right? And so hopefully what we can do is we can figure out how to elevate the conversation around it, connect the dots for people, and really tell a much bigger story. Okay? And so today, as we go through the different talks and we listen to the different experience reports and we have the conversations around the table. What I'm hoping that you guys will help us do is help us as inaugural attendees of this conference, is to help us shape this conversation and help us to identify what are the issues that we need to be talking about. And then hopefully, get some value out of it from your table mates and try to figure out how do you guys take this back and apply it. So if that's the big why of what we're trying to do here, let's talk about what's involved. There's a couple phrases, sometimes if anybody pays attention to our podcasts or blogs or whatever, even speaking events like this, you'll see we often kind of invent things in real time, and we're just thinking about words and ways of communicating around this stuff. And one of the things, a lot of times that I'll see is I'll start to use phrases and I'll use them enough that they actually become kind of at least a thing in my head. And so one of the phrases that I've been talking about is the idea of structural agility, procedural agility, cultural agility, transformational agility. Anybody come from a really hardcore technical background in the room? Just out of curiosity? Yeah. Sometimes hardcore technologists, and I see this a lot in the security space, security engineers or really high-level architect kind of people. They're fascinating because they're the most resistant to Agile on the front side, but they become the biggest supporters of Agile on the backside. And the reason why is because when they first hear the messages around Agile, they go they see this complex technology architecture. They see all of the dependencies and interdependencies within the organization. And they struggle to figure out how a daily stand-up meeting or a quarterly planning event or how a review and retrospective is actually going to solve any of these complex problems that they're talking about. But when you're able to connect the dots and talk about how the practices associated with Scrum or SAFe overlay on top of the business architecture and how the business architecture relates to the technology architecture and what you do in the presence of dependencies and how you break dependencies and how you deprecate compensating controls over time, then they start to go, oh my gosh, this makes a ton of sense. And so kind of my hypothesis here is that if we can figure out how to talk to the business people kind of in a similar way and anchor it, we're gonna get them flipped as well. But in order to get them flipped, we're gonna have to talk about the realities of the world that they live in. And so this idea of structural agility. So let's talk about what that means. So if anybody's ever heard me speak much, I usually talk about the three things, right? I talk about teams, backlogs, working tests, and software. And at the core element of structural agility is how do we form complete cross-functional teams? What do we form them around? And a lot of times what we are inclined to do is we want to form teams around products. Or maybe we want to, if we're in a project kind of metaphor, we want to form teams around projects. But the idea is that teams have to stay together over time, right? Teams are the autonomous unit of delivery within an organization. And so when we're talking about teams and complex systems and we're talking about scale, right, structural agility is about how do I organize my teams around business capabilities, right? How do I align my business capabilities to my technology architecture? How do I put dedicated cross-functional teams on top of that so that they can actually do Scrum in a way that is effective and measurable for the organization? You think about the idea of anytime you want agility in any system, the parts have to be able to move independently. And so structural agility is about how do I build an organization that is componentized in such a way that the pieces can move independent of each other, right? Structural agility, right, is kind of what I've been thinking about with that regard. And then, so on top of structural agility are things that you might call procedural agility. So you think about procedural agility. Do I have processes in place that limit my degrees of freedom? Do I have governance in place that prevents me from adaptation and responding to change? Is the way that I intake work increasing my ability to be agile, or is it decreasing my ability to be agile? The way that I assign people and resources to projects or teams or products, right? How is that playing into our collective ability to be agile, right? So that's what I call like procedural agility, right? So that has to be addressed as well. That tends to be a little bit of where the home base of Agile has been, right, around the processes associated with Agile. But it's also been focused too small, right? It's been focused too much at the delivery and the execution level and not as much in terms of like how the business makes decisions and exploits the development capacity of the teams, okay? So that kind of stuff needs to be considered. And then you have things like cultural agility. And cultural agility gets into a little bit of this mindset conversation. And I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the conversation around mindset and culture because in some ways it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. We want to have a culture where people are open and adaptive in responding to change, but on the other hand, right, we have to have the systems in place, right, the structural agility, the procedural agility that enable that mindset to happen, okay, or that at least reward it or support it or don't fight against it. And so we have this idea of structure, we have this idea of procedure or process, and we have this idea of culture. And ultimately, they all three have to work together. Lately, I've been a big fan of Carol Dweck's book, Mindset. Anybody read that book? It's actually a really fascinating book about fixed mindsets versus growth mindsets. And so, like, even some of the things that we're talking about have to do with if you have a fixed mindset, do you even believe that change is possible? Do you believe that if you put energy into changing the system, that you can affect that system, right? And so there is a little bit of, you got to get people thinking about things the right way, at least a critical mass of people, or maybe even just a starter set of people, so that you can do some of the structural things, so you can do some of the procedural things, so you can enable some of the cultural things. And then an issue near and dear to my heart is the idea of transformational agility. It's like a lot of times we want to say, we have this plan, or we're gonna train all these people in Scrum, and we're gonna do it on this timeline or whatever. But the reality is that transformation is fundamentally a hypothesis unto itself. We have a notional idea of what the structure and what the governance and what the culture is gonna look like. But then we have to start placing bets. We have to start impacting that system. And we have to start testing how it responds. We have to start measuring how it's producing product differently. And if our hypothesis isn't valid, we have to pivot, right? We have to adjust. And so we can't be fixed and rigid in terms of how we're thinking about even going through the transformation, right? We have to make sure that we have the appropriate I don't want to overuse the word mindset, but the appropriate mindset in terms of how the transformation is going to go. How is it going to connect to business value? How is it going to influence our executives? How is it going to influence our stock price? How is it going to influence the markets that we all play in, right? So it's fascinating, right? So once we decide that we're going to elevate the conversation, we're going to take it past the team level, we're going to start having a conversation with the business in a meaningful way, we have to be very clear about what it is that we're asking the business to do and what we're asking the business to participate in. And it's the structural elements, right? We have to have structural agility in place. We have to have procedural agility in place. We have to have cultural agility in place. And once we start, we have to have transformational agility in place. That's just an interesting container to think about. And I don't know if I'll be using that language in a week, let alone a month or two, but it feels like an evolution, right? It feels like it's consistent with how we've been thinking about this stuff so far, okay? And then you get into things like, how are we going to do it now? One of the things that I noodle around on a lot is that once we commit to going down this path, and once we have everybody's buy-in, how are we going to go down the path of actually making this stuff real, okay? And so as an industry, right, as a community of practitioners, one of the things that we tend to focus on is proceduralizing how the work's going to get done once we're already in kind of this future state. And leading Agile, one of the things we talk about is we call that the system of delivery. So if you think about things like Scrum, you think about things like SAFe, large-scale Scrum, disciplined Agile delivery, those things are fundamentally systems of delivery, okay? It's how the work is going to get done. Now, I might extend that out, and if I'm thinking about a full-blown system of delivery, I'm thinking about not only the processes, but I'm thinking about what are the organizational structures? What are the business capabilities? How are we going to organize around the business capabilities? What are we going to do with the technology architecture? How are we going to govern the flow of value? If you think a lot about like what SAFe is kind of fundamentally a particular reference implementation of a governance model that is designed to flow work through Agile teams, right? It's kind of what SAFe is. It's a system of delivery. It's a way of governing. Less is a way of governing. And so the system of delivery encompasses things like how we're going to form teams, how we're going to flow backlogs through teams, what are we going to measure, what are we going to control, how are we going to make economic trade-offs in the face of scarce resources, right? Those kinds of things, okay? So that's system of delivery. But what's interesting is that even though there's debate, maybe even like we might even consider them like methodology wars, right? I don't know if that's a thing so much anymore, if people are still fighting over this stuff. But it's like the system of delivery stuff is fairly well understood at this point. Super valid. It's a first order concern. It's a conversation, but it's fairly well understood. And it's just a matter of figuring out what are the outcomes you want, what's the system of delivery you would like to have, but then the key is how do you create the appropriate ecosystem for that system of delivery to basically realize the business benefits that you want out of it, okay? And Chris actually coined the term, Chris Beal, one of the guys that's going to speak later on today, the idea of a system of transformation. And so there was a lot of things that we were doing internally within Leading Agile and on our engagements to actually help organizations transform. But then we started to recognize that there were kind of patterns. Right? So if anybody's had our website or if you've heard me speak in the past, we talk about the 4 quadrants, we talk about expeditions and base camps. But what was fascinating is as we were learning this stuff and as we were trying to figure it out, it's a really kind of interesting concept to get your head around. And so what we found that we had to do is we had to really define what the base camps were. Like we're going to get predictable, then we're going to reduce batch size, then we're going to break dependencies, then we're going to do team level investment decisions, and then we're going to figure out how to do more lean kinds of startup. And so we defined this progression. Then we found out that that wasn't sufficient. And then we invented this thing called outcomes-based planning, and we started thinking about, okay, in order to get predictable, what are the 10 or 12 leading indicators of that if we do these things every couple of weeks, right, we achieve these outcomes every couple of weeks, that we know that we're making the progression towards it. Okay, well, if I'm going to achieve these outcomes, what resources do I need? What skill sets do I need? What people need to be brought to bear? What guidance do they need, right? All that kind of stuff. And what we found through doing this, and the impetus for us was, as we were growing and hiring people, we had to get our consulting team consistent, but we also had to get our clients on board with how to do it. And what we kind of found out was very much like the system of delivery, the system of transformation was largely definable and repeatable as well. And so what was fascinating is that we have this idea of what the end state looks like, the system of delivery, but we know that there are organizational changes that have to happen to connect the team level execution out to the business, right? So we're elevating this conversation with the business people. And there's this thing that now emerges that's called a system of transformation and a repeatable process for how you get from point A to B, right? So that was kind of fascinating. And then the third piece, and that we're talking about, is the idea of a system of sustainability or a system of continuous improvement. How many people want to put Agile into their organization and lock it down and never let it change? That's supposed to be funny a little bit, right? Because we're all Agilists, right? The reality is that happens a lot, right? So we want to define the process. We want to codify it into something. And then we say, okay, well, this is the business architecture. This is the systems. This is all the different things we want. And then we want to say, okay, it's done now. The reality is that organizations are living, breathing ecosystems, and their business drivers change, their customers change, the technology changes, the business capability changes. And so what we're seeing in some of our longer term clients is the need to establish a system, right? An ability for ongoing change and ongoing adaptation. Okay? And so this idea, system of delivery, system of transformation, system of sustainability. The reason why people don't like system of sustainability is because it abbreviates to SOS, right? And it's like we need help or something like that. So I've been challenged by my team to come up with something other than the system of sustainability. But as a concept, I think it's super powerful. And so kind of here's the fundamental hypothesis around it, right? Is that if we can acknowledge that what we started to do 20 years ago with Agile is the beginning of a conversation, that we've largely done it somewhat poorly over the last 20 years. We've probably burned some political capital with our business partners. We've made some promises that we haven't delivered on. But this was all a necessary part of the evolution of the conversation. We actually had to learn these things in order to be able to understand where this goes, right? If we can kind of acknowledge that, kind of acknowledge where we're at as an industry, and then we can start to say, okay, let's broaden the conversation and let's talk about the breadth of the kinds of organizational things that need to happen in order to be able to achieve the outcomes we want, right? We need to be able to have structural agility. We need to have procedural agility. We need to have cultural agility. We need to have transformational agility. Right? We start to build credibility with our business partners and with the people that are outside of the product delivery organization, or even if you're doing Agile in a non-IT context, right? We start to build credibility that we have a thought process and a pattern that's more than just team level Scrum or SAFe, right? We can start to have a very, very real conversation about that. And then we pivot into, okay, let's define the system of delivery. Let's get everybody really clear and really aligned around what it is that we want to do and kind of point towards a true north, something that we're actually, we can say this is what it looks like when we're done. We can start to articulate a system of transformation that says this is what it's like when we're going to get done, but this is what it's going to look like as we get there. This is how we're going to measure. This is how we're going to prove that we're making the right level of progress, right? Connecting the dots out to the business every step of the way. And then, once we've achieved some baseline level of agility, how are we going to make sure that we're not sliding backwards into non-agile, non-agility kinds of things, right? That's the system of sustainability. And so I think if we're able to do that, we have a broad enough context to be able to walk into any situation and to say, this is what it's going to take. This is how you're going to get the business results that you want. I've had a couple of interactions with some of the other communities around this, and so a couple like the Agile Business Conference guys, right? Some different people, like as we get out and we start having conversations about digital transformation and things. And sometimes, like what I'm a little bit afraid of is that as we try to have this conversation around business agility, like what we're really doing is we're just kind of doubling down on some of the Agile stuff and kind of making demands on the organization that it participates with us in a meaningful way. How many people have ever felt like, man, this Agile stuff would really work if we could just get the business on board, right? Right? It's like a very common question, right? How do I get my product owners, right? How do I get my business partners? Well, the answer to any of those questions, whether we're talking about business partners or executives or what have you, is we have to communicate to them in a language that they understand, and we have to present a value prop that's meaningful to them. And I think a big part of our challenge in elevating this conversation is getting past this idea that Agile works if you would only participate, and move it towards Agile works, and this is the benefit to you. This is how we're going to get there. These are the dollars that you're going to spend. This is the economic leverage that you're going to get on the backside of it. This is how we're going to cost justify it, right? This is how we're going to do all these things, okay? It totally shifts the conversation when you can have the conversation in that context. And then the last bit, right, which is interesting, is we've been fortunate over the last couple years to have some very, very large clients and to have opportunities to participate with them in some very large transformation work. And what you find is that there's a lot of players involved when you're doing something that's 10, 15,000 people, right? Multiple divisions, large enterprises, Fortune 100 companies. Lots of players involved. And so when you're introducing Agile and you're going through this kind of definition of the system of delivery, implementing the system of transformation, building out the system of sustainability, there's a lot of players that you have to get into alignment. Okay? You have outside vendors, right? You have often multiple outside vendors. You have internal people that are actually building the products. You have managers of those people. You have middle managers, executives. You have HR. You have procurement. You have all these different pieces. And so one of the big things that you have to attend to are things like alignment. How do we get everybody on the same page? Not only conceptually, but from an execution perspective. How do we go to the organization and say, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. This is what's expected for you to be on board. And so some of the things that we've noodled around on and implemented, some successful, some not as successful as I would like, is ideas like executive steering committees and transformation leadership teams and councils and ways of engaging leadership in a systematic and structured way to help them understand what's going on so that they can be held accountable and that they can hold your transformation teams accountable, right? So what does it look like to establish and to maintain alignment? Some of the tools that we've explored for doing that, there's an artifact that we started playing around with a couple years ago called a playbook. And it almost seems like the antithesis of Agile to write down in specific granularity how we're going to do Agile. But the reality is that when you're introducing Agile into a place that isn't Agile, right, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of uncertainty. And being able to point to something that is like, this is the way that we're going to do it until we prove that we're not going to do it that way. Right? A lot of times it's like everybody needs to hear kind of like one way. Not to overquote Alistair today, but have you guys been exposed to the whole shuha-re thing? Right? A lot of times, like shuha-re, if you haven't been exposed to it, is, I think it came out of Aikido or something like that, but it's basically like beginner, journeyman, master. And a lot of times, like what we think about is we apply it into something like Scrum, right? That's easy to understand, right? Do Scrum the way that Scrum expects you to do Scrum. And then as you learn, you'll find new tools and techniques, right? And eventually, maybe you won't necessarily need Scrum, right? You'll just be a master at doing this stuff at the team level. And so a lot of times that gets applied in the area of team level agility or even agility at scale is just follow this process blindly until you learn, until you become better at it. But what we find is that complex organizations have their own version of basic Agile. And their own version of basic Agile actually can be kind of complicated in a lot of places because we've got a lot of dependencies that haven't been broken. We have a lot of business architecture that's not aligned, right? We have a lot of challenges within the enterprise that we haven't solved for yet, right? So giving the organization one clear way of doing this, right, is kind of a big deal, right? It creates a lot of safety within the organization. And so this idea of, I use like a kind of a pool metaphor, like the idea of calling your shots. Like this is what we're going to do, right? 8 ball in the corner pocket, and then we do it, and then we say, look, we did it, right? And this is the business benefit that you got out of it, right? So the idea of being able to articulate a plan, engage leadership in that plan, engage the teams in that plan, and then actually execute according to the plan, and to be able to measure the business benefits of that on the backside is a huge, huge lever, right? It creates a tremendous amount of safety for your leadership teams in order to be able to actually get this stuff done. To be able to not only to gain their buy-in, but to be able to maintain it over a long period of time. okay? Because this stuff doesn't flip overnight. Okay? And so this idea of elevating the conversation around Agile is we don't want to have to throw away the work that we've done over the last 20 years figuring this stuff out. We have to recognize that we've burned a little bit of capital with our leaders at times, and they're a little Agile tired at this point. But if we can figure out how to tell this bigger story, paint this big picture, connect the dots for them, I think we can actually keep what we've learned, leverage what we've learned, and build upon it, and not have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay? And so that's the goal, right? So that's the hypothesis of today. And we're going to learn from this. We're going to learn from you guys, and hopefully you guys will learn from us, and we're going to kind of figure this thing out. So Chris talked a little bit about the format of the day. I want to go in a little bit deeper into it. And so the first talk, right, I think Brian Sondergaard has the talk. And what he's going to talk about is kind of the gap, right? He's going to explore like where we're at as an industry versus like where we need to be. But the idea is we're going to talk about that gap, right? We're going to create a space. And the idea behind creating the space is we're going to fill that space later on, right? So the first talk is supposed to create some tension, right? It's supposed to highlight the problem in a little bit more granularity than I've highlighted the problem. And then we're going to move into, okay, so we've got a problem. How do we economically justify solving that problem? And that's, I think, Marty, Jim Cundiff was supposed to be here, but he ended up being sick. And so Marty's going to fill in for him, and we're going to talk about the economic value of going in and doing this kind of stuff. I want to say the third talk is Dennis, and Dennis is going to talk a lot about what Agile organizations have in common, what are the patterns, what are the things to look for, how do you lever things. And then I think there was some change around with Chris Beal and Julianne, or is Julianne and Chris is I think how we're going, right? Yeah, and so now I'm not going to remember exactly who's talking about what, but it's all going to be around road mapping this stuff out. How do you do change management, right? How do you connect the dots? And then so the talks will go that direction. The experience reports will support each of the talks. We have some really interesting companies represented in the room. Again, I don't know who's actually shown up, but I want to say Tim told me we had about 180 different companies that signed up. The speakers represent 5 names that you would recognize, and they'll get up and introduce themselves as they go, and have some really interesting stories about how they've gone down this path and tried to implement some of these ideas that we're talking about. And then so I'm going to get up at the end, and I'm going to put a little bit of a bow around this, and then we'll talk about what we're going to do next year. And we have some big plans for next year that we'll share with you guys. And ability, if you guys have got value out of this one, hopefully you'll come back for the next one. And we'll take it from there. So, sound like a plan? Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
You got it, man.
Thanks.